So it's been 4 years since Apple released the M1 MacBook Air, which saying that out loud is just wild. Like, I don't know of many other products in tech that have managed to stay relevant for so long, especially in the PC market. So in this video, I wanted to do a super long-term review of the M1 MacBook Air to help you decide whether or not it's worth picking up in 2024 and 2025, because there are a few things that you should be aware of. For context, I've been using the base model M1 MacBook Air with 8 GB of unified memory and 256 GB of storage since 2021. And I think the biggest question most buyers will have 4 years later is whether or not the M1 chip is still powerful enough, especially now that we have the M4 chips out. We of course know that laptops and tech in general does tend to slow down over time as Apple adds in new OS updates and apps add in more features, and it does take a toll on your machine's performance. But despite all of that, I haven't actually noticed any slowdowns with the M1 chip. Now, my use cases for this machine have evolved quite considerably over the past 3 years. When I first got the M1 MacBook Air, I was using it primarily as a student for sort of note-taking, handling spreadsheets and PowerPoint documents, taking notes on Notion, and hopping onto Zoom calls with a dozen Chrome tabs open in the background. And I had absolutely no issues whatsoever with the power of the M1 chip. Like, it was just wild how a machine this thin, without a fan, could perform so well. And the performance has of course only gotten better as more and more apps have become optimized for the Apple Silicon architecture. Now that I'm getting more into this content creation stuff, I've started dabbling around with apps like Final Cut Pro and Lightroom and Pixelmator, all of the typical YouTuber creator apps, and the M1 chip continues to breeze through most tasks. Edits generally apply within a couple of seconds, and scrolling through timelines is for the most part quite smooth, with just a couple of drop frames every now and then. Very occasionally, certain apps like Lightroom will slow down and lag a bit, for example when viewing changes to photos, and that's to be expected from a consumer laptop at this price point. Let's face it, Apple wouldn't have made the MacBook Pro if the Air could do everything. But for pretty much all office and entry-level creative tasks, I think that the power that you get in the M1 chip, even in 2024, is more than enough for most people. As for how much RAM you should get, this will somewhat depend on how heavily you multitask. I'm personally one of those people that likes to keep just a few apps open in the background at a time. I find that if I have anything more than 5 windows open at once, my brain just implodes. So because of that, I've actually managed to get away with having just 8 GB of RAM on this machine. The only time I did have issues with the RAM was when I was using a specific program called Stata. It's what a lot of economists use for sort of data analysis and statistical work. And there were a couple of times where my M1 Air just didn't have enough RAM to keep Stata open alongside my research notes and my music playing in the background. So yeah, if you are playing around with multiple intensive applications, I would recommend upgrading to 16 GB of RAM if you can afford it, especially because the RAM on these Macs are non-upgradable. The only thing I will caution though is that RAM upgrades on the Macs can get pretty expensive. And once you cross the $800 to $900 price range, you are very close to the M2 MacBook Air, which now comes with 16 GB of RAM at just $999. When it comes to storage, it would be nice if the MacBook Airs came with more base storage, but beggars can't be choosers. And to be honest, I think that 256 GB is more than enough for most people. Unless I'm storing really large video files on my laptop, I haven't ever had a situation where I've run out of space, especially since most of my files and photos are stored on the cloud. So I expect that 256 GB should be enough for most consumers, and you probably know who you are if it's not. Now, one of the standout features of the M1 MacBook Air when it released 4 years ago was its incredible battery life. In fact, I'm sure it's the reason why a lot of people are considering a MacBook Air today, because the Air models are known for having great batteries that can last up to 2, sometimes even 3 days, depending on your usage. Having said that, these days I am only able to get just under a day's worth of usage before having to charge my MacBook. We're talking around 5 to 6 hours, because, of course, the battery health on this machine has degraded over the years. So I'm not quite able to get a week's worth of use like when I first owned this machine. Now, of course, 5 to 6 hours is still a pretty decent level of usage to be getting after 3 years of ownership. But if you are purchasing an M1 MacBook Air secondhand, you definitely will want to make sure that it has at least 80% of the battery capacity remaining, because battery replacements for MacBooks can get pretty expensive. But otherwise, the battery life for me has been great. There aren't really many other laptops on the market that can compete with it. And what I continue to appreciate the most about it is that when you unplug your MacBook from the charger, you're still able to unlock the full performance of the M1 chip. Whereas with a lot of other laptops, they'll usually slow down and throttle when not connected to a power source. However, there are a few downsides when it comes to purchasing an M1 MacBook Air that I think you should be aware of. The first being that the design is starting to feel a bit outdated, especially with how thick those bezels are. It does make multitasking on the display feel quite cramped on that small 13-inch screen. And it's definitely one of those laptops that you'll want to pair with an external monitor for maximum productivity. Of course, this is mostly a case of you get what you pay for. If you want the sleekest, most modern looking laptops from Apple, you will need to pay a premium for the M2 and M3 MacBook Air models. But equally, I very much do consider design to be a bit of a luxury. And it's not like the build quality of the M1 MacBook Air is inferior in any way. If anything, I'd argue that the wedge-shaped design of the M1 Air allows for a more comfortable typing experience than some of the more recent MacBook models. Another thing to note is that when it comes to the port selection, with the M1 MacBook Air, you do only get two USB-C ports. Arguably, this is just a downside of having such a thin form factor, but it's something to be aware of. And there have been a couple of times where I've been inside of meeting rooms and I've had to connect an HDMI cable to my MacBook, but have been unable to do so because of the lack of port selection on the M1 MacBook Air. And to make matters worse, you can only connect the M1 MacBook Air to one external display at a time using the native USB-C ports, which will be a big limitation for those who are used to using dual monitors in an office environment. Thankfully, though, there is a solution with the brand new Fusion Dock Pro 1 from Ivanki, who are also kindly sponsoring today's video. The Fusion Dock is a sleek and compact 14-port hub that connects straight to your MacBook. It allows for connecting up to three 4K displays, which isn't something that you can do natively with any of Apple's MacBook Airs, along with three USB-C ports and two USB-A ports. It also comes with a built-in gigabit Ethernet port for faster network speeds, an SD card slot, a headphone jack, and much more. The hub also supports power delivery of up to 100 watts, which is enough power to fast charge any MacBook. Ivanki are offering a 10% discount for anyone using the code 4SUPDEEP when checking out. I'll leave a link to their website in the description below if anyone is interested. Make sure to check them out. Another area where the M1 MacBook Air lags behind is in its webcam. With it being only a 720p webcam, it's not my most preferred solution for web calls. So if you're regularly attending meetings on your laptop, it might be worth spending the extra money on an M2 or an M3 MacBook Air just for that better webcam. Or alternatively, if your budget is really stretched, you can also use your iPhone as your webcam using Apple's continuity camera feature, which will allow you to get the highest quality image possible. But yeah, if you're somebody who spends a lot of time on video calls, you're not really going to want to rely on the built-in webcam inside of this thing. Finally, it's worth noting that the displays on the M1 MacBook Air can only reach up to 400 nits of brightness, which is okay if you're using your MacBook primarily indoors, but the moment you hop outside, it does become a bit difficult to view content, especially with the MacBooks having glossy displays. So if you are somebody who works a lot outdoors, or you live in a warm country, that might be something to consider. Of course, I'm sure a concern that a lot of people will have is longevity, especially with the M1 chip being out for over 4 years now. There is a question of how many OS and security updates this machine will continue to receive compared to more recent models, especially now that Apple are already rolling out the M4 chips. Now, to be fair to Apple, they have historically been known to offer OS updates for Macs that are 6, sometimes even 7 years old, because, of course, unlike the iPhone, Apple aren't really adding in tons of new software features to macOS each year. macOS is very much a mature platform at this point. In fact, the most recent version of macOS, macOS Sequoia, supports devices released as far back as 2017, which was over 7 years ago. And those machines were being powered by Intel chips, which were a lot slower than Apple's M series chips. So, based on that, I would imagine that the M1 MacBook Air should receive OS updates for the next 3 to 4, maybe even 5 years. And then you can usually expect an additional 3 years of security updates on top of that, meaning this machine could very well receive support until the end of the decade. But of course, Apple could declare the M1 MacBook Air vintage or obsolete whenever they feel like it. This is just an educated guess based on what they've done in the past. I think the only area where I could potentially see the M1 chip becoming outdated is when it comes to processing on device AI tasks. We've recently seen the rollout of Apple Intelligence with features like writing tools, which are available on the M1 MacBook Air. But of course, Apple have been upgrading the neural engines on their more recent chipsets, which means newer MacBook models will in theory be faster at processing on device AI tasks. So maybe there's an argument to be made that the M1 chip could fall behind in that domain. But having said that, realistically in 2024 and heading into 2025, I don't really see Apple Intelligence being a huge game changer for the Macs. In fact, it's literally going to be in beta until early 2025, and most of its features can easily be replicated for free using tools like ChatGPT. So I don't think that you'll be missing out on much, at least not for the next couple of years. So I wouldn't say there's really a need to future proof yourself here. So who is the M1 MacBook Air really for? I'd say that if you're the type of consumer who typically spends anywhere between $500 to $800 on a laptop, the M1 MacBook Air is still a great buy. The key, though, is to make sure that you are paying under $800 for it. I think that anything more than that, you might want to think about getting an M2 MacBook Air instead, especially since those now start off with 16 gigabytes of RAM, which should future proof you a bit more when it comes to things like the chipset, OS updates, and just the overall hardware. Or alternatively, maybe even consider getting an M4 Mac Mini instead, unless you really need the portability of a MacBook. I think that the base model M4 Mac Mini is going to be an absolute steal for most people, given that it starts off at just $599. And I will have a review for that machine coming up very shortly, so make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss that video. Now, if you've made it this far, you might also want to check out my other video covering some of the best tips and tricks for macOS. Obviously, buying a MacBook is one thing, but knowing how to get the most out of your MacBook and its software is an entirely different game. So I'll leave a link to that somewhere above here. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Make sure to follow me on Instagram and Twitter and subscribe for the next one.